Now we're going to talk a little bit about what I call the aluminum future. This is the future that was seen in the 1960s and 70s. I was actually alive. Okay, so, unsurprisingly, everything changed again after World War II. The expectation of a university education was not true before World War II. But anybody know why it was made into a new expectation? No reason you should, but you might.
Isn't like you should have some knowledge to do some...
Well, yes, but I mean, they needed money. They needed money to go to school.
Like the GI Bill?
Not like, it was the GI Bill. There was a bill passed to give money to veterans to go to college after World War II. And they went in vast numbers. So suddenly, and of course their children would now expect the same thing. So nowadays, you know, many people think that if you don't have some kind of college education, you are ill-educated. Just the way things are. Your parents, I'm sure, think that. The idea computers became either oppressors or liberators. We'll see some video about that. Medical treatment of the food chain, adding steroids and antibiotics and things like that to the food chain, which you know, nowadays they have these organic foods. Of course, they're all organic. Otherwise, you couldn't eat them. So this began in the late 50s, early 60s. The idea of how we go to war and why and with what. What I call full throttle psychology. We'll talk about it. One of the first of the really wrong futures was a book written in 1968 by a guy named Paul Ehrlich called The Population Bomb. And we'll talk about that. And what I call the hippie illusion, which is the idea that the hippies had that they were the forefront of anything. What grew out of this was the idea of a rational future, that we can impose a future through science and engineering, where before it was thought to be done with race or class or other ways that we've already talked about. And that the new hero was the engineer. The engineer was the guy who could do stuff, or the gal who could do stuff. So, now we're going to talk about a very specific event, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Anybody ever heard of it? 1962? What have you heard?
Wasn't it like Russia bought the nuclear missile, landed the nuclear missile in Cuba, and they threatened to fire at Florida?
Well, except for the threatened part, but yeah, basically yes. Okay, so here's the prior events. Cuba goes communist under Castro, tied directly to the Soviet Union for aid and so forth. First Russian arms started arriving in 1961. In April 1961, the Bay of Pigs, called Iba de Coquinos, was actually the name of the place, was defeated. It was an invasion by American-backed rebels to unseat Castro. Kennedy publicly took blame, but privately blamed the CIA and, well, anybody else. It wasn't his fault, it wasn't his fault, it wasn't his fault. We were used to that nowadays. In June, Kennedy meets Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union, and does not come off well. Khrushchev believes he can push Kennedy around. Part of it is that Kennedy was taking massive injections of amphetamines. So he was very up and down. You know, if you've ever known anybody who's on speed, they go very fast and then they go very slow. And that's what he was on. In November, John Kennedy and his brother institute an operation called Mongoose, which was run directly by the White House, not by the CIA, to try and kill Castro, which Robert Kennedy said was the top priority of the entire U.S. government, was to get rid of Castro. So this is the background. We have an embargo on Castro. We've got various ways to try and kill Castro. Kennedy says it's a great idea. The Russians arrived in May 1962 and said to the Cubans, the way you can get the Americans off your back is if we put nuclear weapons here. They won't attack you then. Because we had just attacked them at the Bay of Pigs, right? In April 1962. We had just attacked, 61 rather, we had just attacked them, 62. Anyway, in September 1962, the first Russian missiles arrive. In October, early October, the warheads for the missiles arrive, something we don't know. The Cuban ambassador to the UN says in a speech that Cuba has quote, sufficient means to defend themselves against the nuclear power. That was, late in retrospect, he was saying, look, we got bombed. So, July 12th, U.S. reconnaissance planes discover missile launching sites being built in Cuba. and this is what happens afterwards. Okay, things that we didn't know, we the Americans didn't know. We didn't know that in addition to the 30 missiles with the 1,200 mile range with 1 megaton, they had 30 of those and 12 short-range nuclear missiles and 80 even medium-range nuclear missiles. These could almost reach Florida, but could certainly be used against an invasion force. You know, ships out in the water. Both could be fired without asking Moscow, just fire them off. Kennedy didn't know, he thought the warheads weren't in Cuba yet, they were, and that there were 40,000 Russian combat troops in Cuba that could be used in the defense. He didn't know any of those things. So, this is a very short form, very short form. Kennedy announces that the missiles are there. This is a speech to the nation, demands that they be removed.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The Russians refuse. Kennedy says, okay, we're going to blockade Cuba, no more. Military stuff comes into Cuba, hoping to stop the warheads from coming in. But they're already there, he doesn't know that. The Russians respond to the various U.S. messages in a very blunt, antagonistic way, and then in a much more reasonable way from our point of view. The Russians say, you've got missiles in Turkey and Italy and England and France and Germany aimed at us. If we're going to take those missiles out of Cuba, you got to take the missiles out of Turkey. The reason they picked Turkey was because Turkey was thought to be possibly seized by the Russians in the event of war. So they say to Kennedy, take the missiles out of Turkey, we'll take the missiles out of Cuba. Kennedy agrees, but tells the Russians they can never tell anybody that he made that agreement, and nothing in writing. That's a violation of the NATO treaty. We're not allowed to just do that without the permission of the Turks, because these are to defend Turkey. Well, he didn't care. Kennedy was hailed as being the winner. He faced down the Soviets and got them to move out with no side effects, and it wasn't true. But it was in the Russians' interest and in our interest to behave as if that had happened. That's the short form of it. Let's do some what-ifs. The original plan for our intervention in Cuba was to bomb the missile sites. We had planes flying over taking pictures all the time. And we could find, they weren't like silos, they were above ground. We knew where they all were, we could bomb them. That was the original plan. The target date was October 30th. So that's 2 weeks after they've been found. What happens if we do that? Well, most certainly an active war, yes, very true. What will the Russians do in response? Fire back from where? To where? If they'll attack Turkey. All right. Anybody else? Nobody else? Okay. But we can agree that the Russians will respond somehow. One of the things they might do is they might fire the missiles that don't get knocked out in Cuba at the United States. That's another possibility. On October 27th, one of the reconnaissance aircraft was shot down by a Russian missile. The Air Force wanted to bomb all the anti-aircraft sites to make sure that they could keep taking pictures. Kennedy said no. What happens if we did that? What happens? We bomb just the anti-aircraft sites that are defending the missiles. So in other words, so this is 3 days before the intended bombing of the missiles themselves. We bombed just the anti-aircraft defenses of the missiles because they shot down one of our planes. They did, in fact, shoot down one of our planes, kill the pilot. Okay. Well, that's an interesting question. The U.S. military said that this bombing of the missile sites should be done with nuclear weapons. But if we bombed the sites, the plan was to invade Cuba. The United States went to what's called DEFCON 2, which is one sort of actual war, and started putting airborne troops and ships with transports with reservists and on-duty and regular personnel in ports in New Orleans and in Florida to land on Cuba. What happens if we do that? And that was intended to be with nuclear weapons to soften up the defenses. What happens? You have to look at, here's a present, what's the future? Come on, that's what the whole class is about. What's the future? What future do we get out of that?
People might start using nuclear missiles for every invasion or war or something.
Okay, so so people, all right, so you're saying that the Russians might shoot those missiles that we don't know about at the invasion force. Okay, so now we're bombing the crap out of Cuba and the waters around Cuba. Anything else happen? We're invading Cuba. What else happened? The Russians have to react somehow. Otherwise they look, in the thing, they look powerless in the old lingo of the era.
Can they attack Alaska?
What?
It's closer.
Well, with what?
They can attack one of our allies.
Okay, fair enough. Turkey or something. All right, fair enough. What happens after that? They attack Turkey. We landed in Cuba. Many deaths because everybody's using nuclear weapons. Probably hundreds of thousands of U.S. and Cubans are being killed. But we're still doing the invasion. The Russians attack Turkey. What happens after that? What do we do? We bomb Russia. Okay, and they bomb up. And hooray, end of the world. That's what I'm trying to get to. Okay? See here, the Russians react to an invasion of Cuba by invading Berlin, Germany, or what happens if the Cubans decide to seize the missiles from the Russians and say, we'll decide when they get fired? These are all things that you can't, your rational strategy just doesn't work. But the guys who were doing the strategies at the time believed in this magic thing called game theory. Game theory is always defined as the interaction between two competing rational individuals or entities. Okay, so they're all saying, well, they'll do this and then we'll do that, and then okay. That's not the way it really works. What we're doing here is two crazy people. Okay, we've been saying for a decade, you attack in Europe and we'll bomb your country to ash. And they've been saying, you attack, you do that, and we'll bomb your country to ash. We're both acting like crazy people, telling our own people that we're very sane and rational, telling the other guys we're nuts, you can't depend on what we'll do.
And the abbreviation for that was mutual assured destruction, or mad, right? Crazy.
No, that's a joke I detest. Because it's flexible response that does game theory. Mutually assured destruction just says boom,
Right.
also known as the nuclear orgasm. Rational nuclear strategy, and at the time known as these words here, flexible response. Okay, the idea is they'll do something and then we'll do something, and since we don't actually talk directly to each other, at this time there was no hotline, there was no way for the United States and the Russians to talk to each other except by issuing radio messages on their different news outlets. So we'll do this, they'll do that, and that means to us that we should do this, and so we'll communicate with each other by killing millions of people. That was their scheme. Flexible response. But you can't depend on it. So that the future, these guys, their future said, we're rational and they're rational. Because, well, we know we are, and they're just like us. But we tell them we're crazy. So what are they going to do? They're going to say, well, they're crazy. They're going to believe us that we're crazy. So they're going to fear us, and they're going to want to attack us before we attack them. Okay? This is the nuclear strategy that I grew up with. This is not, doesn't let you sleep very well at night.
And
So-
it's what happened without the nuclear weapons in World War I, and that gave rise to World War II and all the problems and trouble.
That was the flaw. Their future said, game theory, rational players, we can guess what they're gonna do because we know they're rational. They say they're crazy, we tell them we're crazy. So we can't depend on anything. Okay.
There was another limitation of game theory at that time, besides being rational. It assumed you were only going to play the game once with people, rather than a sequence of games. And what Charles mentioned about the lack of communication has something to do with that too. It's a little bit like in any business negotiation. If you're doing something in business with a person, a transaction, and you know that you're never going to see that person again, they're going to be tempted to cheat you and you're going to be tempted to cheat them, right? Whereas if you know you're going to have to negotiate many times later, make many business deals, chances are you'll both pull back, right? It's the beginnings of what's known of trust between mistrustful people.
Yeah, that is that we go back to being rational, where I know that you will do things that are in your self-interest. They may not be in my interest, but I can depend on you acting in your own self-interest. But through this period, we were saying, you do anything that pisses us off, we're going to blow you the kingdom come. Got some movies.
There was a very famous movie called Dr. Strangelove, or How I Got to Love the Bomb, with Peter Sellers, that came out in the 60s.
They were actually
making fun about everything that we're talking about here, in a very dark way, since it ends with the American general riding a bomb down onto Russia.
That's correct. That's Slim Pickens. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what I call the aluminum future. This is the future that was seen in the 1960s and 70s. I was actually alive. Okay, so, unsurprisingly, everything changed again after World War II. The expectation of a university education was not true before World War II. But there were actually two movies. Dr. Strangelove was actually a parody of another movie called Failsafe, which postulated that there would be a failure of what was called the failsafe mechanism, which was, the idea was that if anything went wrong with our control of nuclear weapons, it would always fail without anybody getting killed. But in the book and the movie, that failsafe failed. And we dropped bombs on Moscow. And in response, to stop a general war, we dropped bombs on New York. And this movie is a parody of that movie, saying that such rationality is just impossible. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what I call the aluminum future. This is the future that was seen in the 1960s and 70s. I was actually alive. Okay, so, unsurprisingly, everything changed again after World War II. The expectation of a university education was not true before World War II. But do you think that if we accidentally bombed Moscow, would we actually bomb our own city? Would we kill, without warning, would we kill 8 or 9 million people just to preserve the nation? You don't know. Okay, well, okay, fair enough.
Well, one of the reasons that a lot of historians speculate that we didn't blow the Russians up and they didn't blow us up during the Cuban Missile Crisis was that Kennedy had actually fought and suffered through World War II, and Khrushchev had fought and suffered through World War II also, so they both knew exactly what a disaster war could be. I don't know how real that is, that's why I say a lot of historians speculate that way, but there's some possibility that it had some effect.
Well, if anybody saw war right away, it was Khrushchev, because he was in Stalingrad. Anyway, so this is, now we're going to talk about computers as oppressors and liberators. So we're done with the Cuban Missile Crisis. All I wanted to show you is that the assumptions about the future were this: we can do this and deal with the Russians indefinitely, while we tell them that we're nuts and we'll kill them if we have to. And that was the flaw. But that strategy continued into the 1970s because they couldn't think of anything else to do. If you don't tell the Russians that you're crazy enough to blow them to kingdom come, then they're not going to believe you'll ever do anything. You have to tell them you're crazy. It's the only way nuclear weapons work as a deterrent. And they'll treat you like you're crazy, and then you have to treat them like they're crazy, and then it gets out of hand. This is from a movie called Colossus the Forbidden Project, in which a computer, who will be the voice besides this fellow that you will hear, that was built to control the nuclear defenses of the United States. So this was in 1967, so long before Terminator. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what I call the aluminum future. This is the future that was seen in the 1960s and 70s. I was actually alive. Okay, so, unsurprisingly, everything changed again after World War II. The expectation of a university education was not true before World War II. But anybody know? So there's a lot of the computerized oppression fear right there in one movie. That we might hand computers so much power that they would be able to oppress us, tell us what to do.
And in 2001, The Space Odyssey, you had precisely a situation like that in
Now we're going to talk a little bit about what I call the aluminum future. This is the future that was seen in the 1960s and 70s. I was actually alive. Okay, so, unsurprisingly, everything changed again after World War II. The expectation of a university education was not true before World War II. But, well, that's different, because they actually gave a psychological dilemma to the computer.
to hell. Yeah.
And that's another story. So, what allegory can we have for this? They build this computer. They give it as much power as it can have to defend them. It becomes self-aware and decides that they are no longer fit to rule themselves. Where have we seen that before? Well, that's later, isn't it? Some would say the Terminator came from this in a way. But we've seen this with humans. Soviet Union.
Ancient Egypt.
Ancient Egypt. Okay?
Ancient China.
Give me all the power, I'll tell you what to do, and you will be happy.
The Great Wall of China. How was it produced?
Okay?
Precisely that way.
Freedom is an illusion. You don't need it. You don't want it. I'll tell you what to do. It'll be great. Okay? That's the same problem. It's the same fear. But now we've transferred it to an inhuman. One might say a godlike inhuman. We've given this thing the power to destroy cities. A god could do. That's the fear that's computerized fear. What's wrong with the computerized fear? What's wrong with the fear of that's presented? What's wrong with that? Why is that a wrong future? Or an extremely unlikely future?
Computer does not show any emotion.
Well, no, computers don't show emotions now. In fact, they don't show intelligence now. I mean, that's the whole idea, is that this is an inhuman intelligence. This is not making the mistakes that we make. But to do that, we have to give it our lives. We have to tell this thing to tell us what to do and what not to do. What's the flaw in this future?
Yes, that they'll be like that self-aware.
That's very much true. That to this day we have not come up with any way to even begin. I don't care what Elon Musk says or anybody else. To begin to come up with a self-aware computer, we have no idea. We don't even know what awareness is in humans. Okay, nobody knows why we have a self-awareness that an ant doesn't. Presumably, we're not sure about the ant. Is it there's people who say, well, it's all you need is a certain number of neurons and self-awareness. But nobody knows. Nobody knows for sure. It's like saying, well, why are some people more intelligent than others? Nobody knows that either. So how on earth can we put that into a computer if we can't even understand it in ourselves? So that's one of the problems. The other problem, of course, is is this is very unlikely that we would do such a thing. It's very unlikely we would take all of the power to destroy cities and hand it off to anything we couldn't control. It's just, it's kind of, it's suicide.
Well, we've done it repeatedly with dictators and various
Well, indeed,
emperors and
that's,
kings.
it never goes well. But I mean, and you said the Terminator, okay? What happens, they hand all that power to a machine and the machine says, I don't need you. Boom. Everybody dies. By giving the power to another entity, whatever you may think it is, you've already given up your freedom. Because they have all the power and you have none. So that's the flaw in that future and in all of the computer oppressive futures, is that we would have to allow it to happen.
And yet, a certain percentage of our population obviously does like the idea of having a strong man, so, you know, it's not that unusual even in
Do I get the
democracies.
impression that you don't like Donald Trump?
Well,
THX 1138, these are other movies we won't watch. Computer as liberator. Exhibit number 1. Exhibit number 2. What has the computer allowed us to do that we could not do before? Or could not do easily? Access information of amazing amounts. Wikipedia is a very dangerous thing because it's easily abused. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But you can get information that your parents could only get by going to a library and thumbing through 50, 60 books. And you can get it, just go, search for this, and boom, puff. So you have this huge leg up on just the raw information. And that's very liberating, because now your time is not spent reading vast amounts of things you don't need. I can also contact anybody. Well, pretty much anybody. Nearly anybody in the world. Before this, maybe phones, you know, the big old dial phones and so forth, but usually letters or not at all. Okay. So I have this connectivity with the rest of the world that I just didn't have. And things are happening based on a connectivity that nobody foresaw. Things like WikiLeaks.
have you heard the latest on WikiLeaks? What Assange said today?
Well, he said he was going to give out some more stuff.
Right.
All right.
Lots more stuff
Yeah.
before the election.
Okay, well, that's the best time. WikiLeaks would be impossible 20, 30 years ago. Why? Why would it be impossible 30 years ago? That's it. Maybe 40 years ago. Before you could have a computer in your house. Let's put it that way.
Difficult to find that most of the people when you look at it.
You're looking at in the wrong direction. It's the right reason, but on the wrong side. It's easy to stop. In other words, let's say that Julian Assange has all this information, and he wants to get it out to as many people as possible. Well, he has to print it on newsletters or something and mail it to people. Okay? And that's very expensive. And he won't know who wants it. So most of that money would be wasted. With the web, it's the people who want to know go for free and get what he wants to say. There's no cost to him except keeping his web server running. And also, he's relatively immune to being killed. Not to put too fine a point on it. Something that Mr. Snowden had perhaps more trouble with. Okay, but what Snowden found out got out to many places who could not be talked about. In the past, in the 1960s, for instance, a reporter from the New York Times found out about the deal between Kennedy and the Russians about missiles in Turkey, and was going to write a story about it. And the White House got news of it because the New York Times called him up and asked for commentary. The president called up the publisher of the New York Times and says, please kill that story. And so they did. So nobody knew about it for 15 years. Can't do that anymore. Because it's everywhere and with everyone who cares. So that's liberating. That means that nobody can hide, that anything that anybody can find out, everybody can know. That's a huge change. Sometimes that's bad, but usually it's good. Any other ways that computers might liberate us from earlier days?
Not have to go out, you can buy stuff.
Well, I can buy anything well, anything that can be bought, I can buy, usually at a relatively low price. Because now, because of the computers, the guys who sell the stuff don't have a store. They just have a warehouse. So they don't have to pay for the store, they don't have to pay for the employees, so their prices are lower. And that's not necessarily a good thing. You've probably heard about, there was the mom and pop stores, which was from, say, up to about 1950. And then there were these giant Sears, and they were knocking out the mom and pop stores because they worked in bigger volumes, they could have lower prices. And then there was Walmart, who did the same thing to Sears, because what they did was they bought things from China, which was cheaper, and so they undercut Sears, and now Sears bought Kmart, and they're both going out of business. And the mom and pop store suffered again. And what happened to Walmart? Amazon. Okay. Amazon, you can go there, you can buy anything, and I'm a Prime member. It comes in 2 days. I got things I order on Friday that can show up on Sunday. Wow.
If you're really lucky, one day.
Yeah. So actually, there's going to be a distribution center opening up near me, so probably.
And with drones, no less.
So, but the only reason that Amazon works is because of computers and computer networks. It's impossible otherwise. The only other way you could do this would be with what's called the old Sears catalog. I don't know, have you ever even seen any of them? They're Sears catalog. And you would send mail to Sears, say, I want to buy you could buy many things, you could buy tractors. For many things, for small things, you could even buy them COD, cash on delivery. So you could order them without having the money on hand. You just had to have the money by the time they arrived. And so that's sort of the early part of credit cards. And so what do we have here? We also have this network of banks and credit cards. So now I don't have to have cash at all. I think I've got like $1 in my pocket. That's it. And so if I can use a drink machine. Okay. So the banks are on the net, Amazon on the net. The only thing that's saving the post office, in fact, is Amazon. Because Amazon sends all this stuff via post office. And so the post office has enough business to stay in business. So this is a liberation, unless you're one of these or one of these or one of these. Okay? For us, liberated because now I don't have to go to the mall and look in 5 stores and waste all that time just wandering around trying to find the thing I want to buy. I can go to Amazon or Alibaba or one of the other ones and just say, I want this, send it to me. Poof, it arrives. If I don't like it, I send it back. They'll even pay to send it back. So that's the liberation, the economic liberation is in the time that we, the consumers, have to use in buying. I'm going to talk a little bit about the medicine and the food chain. This was another future that has not turned out well. In the 1950s, the late 1950s, this was the first steroid to be put in cattle. It was originally given to pregnant women in the mistaken belief that it would reduce complications in birth. It's a estrogen inhibitor. And in cattle it causes testosterone to rise, and then testosterone rises, it bulks up faster, and there's got leaner meat and so forth and so on. So in the 1950s they started putting this in the cattle feed, so the cattle would eat it and obtain the steroid. What's the problem with that? Sure enough, the cattle get bigger. Sure enough, the cost per cow goes down because I get more meat out of every cow. What's the problem? Right, we eat it. The steroids don't leave the cow. They're in the meat, we eat the meat. The same is true, I didn't come up with all those, but they also started putting antibiotics in chicken feed. So the chickens would live longer because there was a problem. Have you ever seen where they quote grow chickens unquote, like prison of war camp for chickens? And so they die a lot. And if they get a disease, a lot of them die a lot. So they started putting antibiotics in the chicken feed. So what's the problem with that? We eat the chickens and we have the antibiotics. And there are some people, not everybody, who say that the problem we have with antibiotic resistance, you've heard about that, right? Where the antibiotics have to keep getting stronger and stronger, is because we're dosing ourselves with antibiotics. It's not so much that, they say, well, the doctors are handing it out like candy. Yes, they are. If you have a virus and they give you an antibiotic, forget it, it doesn't help. We've been intaking antibiotics for decades, all my life, all your life, in the foods. And so we've built up, we and all the bugs in us have built up resistances to these antibiotics, which is one of the reasons that we're having all these problems. So that's another failed future, right? Oh, we'll just add drugs to the thing, it'll be great. And not so good. There's another failed future, which we'll talk a little bit about, called what I call full throttle psychology. Starting in the 1950s after World War II, it was determined that psychology could be used to help people and perhaps to make them do things you wanted to do, advertising. Put a pretty lady in the ad and people will buy it more often. Psychology. So the CIA decided to try some of the new psychedelics and what are called psychoactive drugs, LSD, mescaline, things like that, and see if it helped to make people more susceptible to being questioned, or to see if it would make them, this is from about 1952 on. We also tried hypnosis, subliminal advertising things, and so forth and so on. Oh yes, and here we go. Inducing amnesia, so that you could program something, tell somebody to give him an order to do something, then induce amnesia in him so he wouldn't remember being given the order, but would still remember the order. And what is called behavior modification, which might best be summed up as making assassins. The idea was that you would have some combination of drugs and hypnosis and so forth, and turn people into assassins that wouldn't even know they were assassins. If you ever see a movie called The Manchurian Candidate, see the early one with Frank Sinatra, the other one with Denzel's not as good. There's another failed future, which we'll talk a little bit about, called what I call full throttle psychology. Starting in the 1950s after World War II, it was determined that psychology could be used to help people and perhaps to make them do things you wanted to do, advertising. Put a pretty lady in the ad and people will buy it more often. Psychology. So the CIA decided to try some of the new psychedelics and what are called psychoactive drugs, LSD, mescaline, things like that, and see if it helped to make people more susceptible to being questioned, or to see if it would make them, this is from about 1952 on. We also tried hypnosis, subliminal advertising things, and so forth and so on. Oh yes, and here we go. Inducing amnesia, so that you could program something, tell somebody to give him an order to do something, then induce amnesia in him so he wouldn't remember being given the order, but would still remember the order. And what is called behavior modification, which might best be summed up as making assassins. The idea was that you would have some combination of drugs and hypnosis and so forth, and turn people into assassins that wouldn't even know they were assassins. If you ever see a movie called The Manchurian Candidate, see the early one with Frank Sinatra, the other one with Denzel's not as good. The thing that surprised me, 30 US universities helped out. They took the money from the CIA to do these kinds of studies with drugs and hypnosis to see if they could make people do things that they wouldn't normally do. And and by the way, the failure of that future was they determined that they couldn't reliably do any of that. It turned out that people are just too weird, that you cannot say, give him that drug and do this, and he will do that. You just can't do it. It just doesn't work. People are too individual.
Unpredictable.
Well, too individualistic, but yeah, okay. The Milgram experiment. Stanley Milgram at Yale decided that he wanted to determine if the Germans who ran the prison of war camps were really any different than the Germans today. You want to find out if you told somebody that higher authority said it was okay to do something, no matter how reprehensible, they would do it. Because that was his thesis, was that the Germans were really just normal people who were told it was okay to do these horrible things, and so they did them. So this is a short description of what's called the Milgram experiment.
About 2 years ago, I was in the Veterans Hospital in West Hill.
So this is
a while later, they detected a heart condition.
student.
Nothing serious.
This is the teacher. That's the guy who runs the thing.
How strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were...
So, the subject of the test is actually told that the other guy is the subject of the test. And then all he has to do is follow the instructions given to him by the test organizer to complete the test. And as we will see in a minute, you're supposed to give the subject questions, and if he gets them wrong, you're supposed to shock him with electric shock. The more questions he gets wrong, the higher the voltage is. And the real purpose of the test is to see how high the guy doing the shocks will go.
Seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard hit.
Now, the responses that he's getting from what he believes is the subject are actually tape recorded, so they're exactly the same
Milgram was very much aware
for every one of the subjects. Whenever you zap him with 100 volts, you always, every guy got the same response. So there was no variation based on the guy being shocked.
Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices.
So
My number one choice is that I would...
invariably they would turn to
Now, this
the
man makes
Stanley Milgram and
disobedience
say,
seem a very rational and
"I'm
simple deed. Now, other
And
subjects respond
he would
quite
say,
differently to
"It's
the
imperative
experimental
that you finish.
authority."
I'll be responsible.
Wrong. Here.
And a surprising number
5 volts.
would go upward and upward and upward, and some, it won't show in this, would go all the way to the top, and because there were more questions, just keep doing it. And when you got to the top, there was no response, as if the person was dead, and they would still do it.
Laughing hysterically and inappropriately.
50 volts.
So that's the Milgram experiment. This is the psychology trying, again, to figure out how to make better people.
Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out.
And he says, the way to do it is to, if you tell people it's legal and moral to do reprehensible things, they'll do them for you. Because you have an authority. The only measure of authority that Stanley Milgram had was a lab coat. That's it. He wasn't, he just had a lab coat. That was his badge of authority. But that was enough. Anybody ever hear of the Milgram experiment before? I mean, if you take a psychology course, you will. And like I said, he started to try and do this on Germans, and he was just doing it on Americans just to make sure that his test mechanisms were correct. But he brought up, everybody does it. If you give some people, a moral bomb, a way to say, this is not your fault. Whatever happens, I'm to blame. You can do whatever you do, I told you. People will do it. And they will do things that they would not normally do because you say it's okay. But the most famous one of these was called the Stanford experiment by a guy named Zimbardo.
I did a paper.
Huh? You did a paper on Zimbardo? What do you think of it?
I mean, my paper was about evil, but I sort of saw his video and used his example and stuff. It was kind of interesting. So.
You used his example? What, you got a bunch of people in the basement and speed them up?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
Not physically.
Okay. Well, you error checked me. Okay. Zimbardo decides, now the thing to remember is that Zimbardo wanted to prove something. He was not like Milgram. Milgram was trying to prove something, and he wound up proving something else. Zimbardo wanted to prove something, and he made absolutely sure he could prove it. That's the thing to remember about Zimbardo. So, what he wanted to prove was that prisons are evil, period. That people are evil, prisoners are evil because the prison makes them so. Okay, so, he got, I think it was 40 students. Half of them were designated to be guards, and half of them were designated to be prisoners. They were put into jail cells in the basement of a building at Stanford. It was supposed to run for 14 days. The idea was that you would just point cameras and keep track of what people were doing and just see what happened. The idea was, what kind of social interaction would evolve between the prisoners? If I say you're prisoners and you're guards, what is going to evolve between the two of you? And is there anything we can learn from that about modern prisons? Supposed to go on 14 days, only goes 6 because most of the prisoners are showing psychological problems. Some of them had actual breakdowns. The prisoners are being abused by the guards. Things are not going well. If I tell you that Zimbardo inserted himself into the experiment as the warden of the prison, what's wrong with that?
Bias?
You don't get the answer.
So influencing the outcome. By
Exactly. Okay? He's the warden. He's the ultimate authority. Okay? He's the one who tells the guards what to do. The original intention, the experiment was written up was, give the guards minimal background, just say, you're prison guards, and let them go. Just see what happens. It's not what happened. He put himself in so he was able to give out instructions to the guards in the middle of the experiment, and he was able to determine punishments for prisoners in the middle of the experiment based on what he knew about them from their psychological testing. Okay? So that's wrong. He also videotaped everything. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with videotaping it?
people perform for the camera.
You gotta stop answering right. He's correct. Okay? If people know they're being watched, they act differently. Okay? So the guards knew that they were being watched, and Zimbardo had people come in to coach the guards on what to do. And he told the guards to act tough, to act up, to go overboard. So he ruined his own experiment by forcing people to do things that he wanted them to do, regardless of what the experiment was. The other was no control. Okay, whenever you do a psychological experiment, you have to have a control where you set up another group in a similar situation and do nothing to it. That way you know the difference. That way you can figure out what the situation is doing versus what the interactions are doing. He didn't do that. Nevertheless, he has dined out on this story for the rest of his life. There's a new movie just came out. You can pay about $10.99 to go see it. You can send him $110 and he'll send you a video, or you can watch it for $12 on YouTube. So he's made lots and lots of money on really terrible psychology, and to this day people quote that as valid results. Why is that there? And what does it say about the people who are quoting the results? Well, they're not real. Yes, they're not real results. But why are people still quoting it and using it as reasons for doing things?
Resource to look it up.
Well, that's sort of. That's the YouTube answer. It's an interesting answer. No, it's an interesting answer that it's you can be lazy and say psychological experiments and you get Zimbardo. Interesting idea. It's because they already have made up their minds. In other words, this was a cooked up experiment to prove one thing, and people are quoting it because they want it to be true. But that is in the 1960s, so now we're trying to use university psychology. He's a Stanford professor, he still is, as a matter of fact, to abuse people to make a proof of something that demonstrably isn't true. For instance, what he did was he divided the guards up into, the prisoners in half and half. And he said it did it randomly. What's wrong with that? You think in psychology, oh, we'll do it randomly. That's okay. That's not how it works in real life. Guards volunteer to be guards. Prisoners don't volunteer to be prisoners. So it's not random at all. You get two entirely different types of people. But he said, well, it doesn't matter. Anybody, I can take anybody and this will be true. And it just wasn't true. Yeah. The hippie illusion. You can read that for yourself. As you can see, I'm fairly opinionated. The problem with the hippie illusions is that they still guide a lot of people these days. That the money will always come from somewhere. From the rich, who are always defined as somebody who has more money than you. That if you disengage from society, you may now dictate what the society should do. You know, I'm an outsider now, I can tell you what to do. What? Okay. That feeling good is more important than doing good. And that awful, evil, raising awareness thing. I hate. What does that mean? What does raising awareness mean? It means I sit on my ass and post things on the internet, and I'm no longer responsible for any of society's ills. Well, horse hockey on that. The population bomb. We'll just do some quick, really, really wrong futures. In 1968, a guy named Paul Ehrlich published a book called The Population Bomb, in which he asserted that there were going to be mass starvation in the next 10 years. The battle to feed all of humanity is over in the 1970s. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death. He says 60 million people in the United States would starve to death in the 1970s. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. He said that we were just running out of food, period. He said what we had to do was what he called temporary sterilants, put sterility drugs in the food and in the water, and sterilize the entire population so they could have no children. Create a Department of Population and Environment with powers to take whatever steps are necessary. What does that mean? Well, it could mean sterilization, it could mean killing. All men with 3 or more children, sterilized, period. Get 3 children, sterilized. Get it, no more children for you. Doesn't matter if they die, too bad. And if a country doesn't do what we want in the way of population control, we don't give them any food. We starve them to death. That was his idea. What's wrong with that future? Besides being entirely reprehensible. That's the basic problem. By the way, Ehrlich still says he was right, which is very strange, but there you are. Okay. World death rate, 1960, 2015, the world death rate has been going down, not up. Obviously, people are not starving to death in their millions. The world death rate for children under 5, down. U.S. births per 1,000 women in the United States, relative down to a certain point and then sort of going along at a certain rate. Births per 1,000 women in the world, down. Percentage of people who are undernourished by, this is from the Federal Aid Organization. So 35% were undernourished. That means they were eating, but they weren't getting enough food, and that's been going down and down and down. So what does that mean about Ehrlich's solution, besides that it was not necessary?
The opposite is happening.
Well, not the opposite is happening.
It's getting
I mean, we still got more people.
yeah.
But it was happening anyway. In other words, let's go back and look at, in other words, he says the birth rate has to go down. In the United States, so he writes the book in 1968, it's already gone down. It's gone down a lot. It's already happening. I'm not sure what this little bump is for. And in the entire world, it's already happening. Okay, we're right here, and it's just continued. It was happening anyway. Nevertheless, he says he was right. Okay? So that's another problem about the future, is that you have to be aware of what's happening in the present, or else the future will look silly in the future. But unless you're Paul Ehrlich, and so why? Better plants, better yields, better distribution. Not as many people are using food as a weapon. And so the question is, why does anybody still believe him? People still quote him. They still say he was right. He still says he's right. Why? I'll show you a bit of a movie to give you a view of what else was being said at the time. Let's see here.
2022. Nothing runs anymore. Nothing works. But the people are the same. And the people will do anything to get what they need.
This is the police.
What they need most is Soylent Green.
The supply of Soylent Green has been exhausted. Return to your home.
This movie was made in 1968, same year the book came out.
The secret of Soylent Green. Search for the secret of Soylent Green. You will find out why Soylent Green means life. You will find out why Soylent Green means death.
We gotta stop them.
What is the secret of Soylent Green?
Please.
Anybody seen the movie? Oh, okay, then I won't give it away.
Well, I think
What?
video game reference.
Oh, okay, you probably would. But anyway, so that was the future that people like Ehrlich saw. Okay? So many people that they were literally a carpet on the planet, fighting for food. Ehrlich said that there were going to be wars fought just for food. Why do people still believe that that's possible? Or likely, let's put it that way. It's certainly possible, I think it's possible. It's an easier answer than you think. Because it fits in with their preconceptions. Okay? You know, there's too many people. We got to get rid of some. I got a quote from one of Ehrlich's friends, where he says, "We want fewer people, we want fewer babies and the right kind of babies."
There's too many people, and we'd like to see people have fewer children and better ones.
Because you scratch people like that, and what they want is they want more of themselves and fewer of everybody else. They want more white babies, or more black babies, or more whatever. So it falls into the simple trap of everything will be great except for all those other people. I'm doing fine, I'm doing great, I'm doing the right thing. We got to get rid of that. Which has been going back to the 20s and the 30s, right? It was just a different them. It was the Jews. It was, the Russians. It was whoever it was. We had to get rid of them. It's a thing that we never seem to get out of. So, wrong future number 2. Vietnam War. When the United States intervened in Vietnam in 1956, we had a view of the world that said that Vietnam was just another one of what were known at the time as brush fire wars between the Soviet Union and the United States, where we were all just sort of feeling around the edges. And so this was after the Korean War, where North Korea invaded South Korea, and you see that still facing each other. The war hasn't technically ended yet. And so we had a Greek crisis with communism, an Italian crisis, and a Czech crisis, and the Chinese became communists, and the Russians launched an atomic bomb, detonated an atomic bomb, the Korean War. Egypt falls to Nasser and becomes a Russian client. Iran, the Shah is put in power and becomes an American client. Guatemala becomes an American client. The Warsaw Pact makes Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia and all these other places clients of the Russians. Venezuela, on and on and on and on and on. Is that a pattern? Is there a pattern to that? Well, as it turns out, no. But there isn't really a pattern. The Russians were just trying different things because they felt like it. And there was no master plan from the Russians. And so we thought there was a master plan, and so we reacted and said, Vietnam looks like it might fall to the communists, we must react. We said, this fits into our pattern. Our pattern is, the Russians are trying to get all these places, and we gotta stop them. I think I have a graphic of the domino theory here. So, who thought so? Eisenhower thought so, Kennedy thought so, Johnson thought so. Lots of Americans thought so. Lots of people said, this is a pattern. The Russians are trying all over the place, and we gotta stop them everywhere we can. And the other thing that came out of it was called the domino theory, which was the idea that if one place falls, it makes it easier for the next place to fall. So here in the 1950s, we have the Chinese have invaded Tibet, and so they may invade Burma and Thailand and blah, 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 blah. And so because the communists control China, now all this is in play. In the 1960s, If Laos falls, Vietnam falls, Taiwan falls, Korea falls, the Philippines, Japan, Canada, the United States. If Laos falls, the United States falls. Oh my God, gotta do something. Okay? Over here, and there two were reversed. 1970. Vietnam, then Laos, then Cambodia, then Thailand, then Burma, then India, then Bangladesh. India? Really? You know? But this is the pattern. This was the future they saw. And they decided that the pattern that they saw in the present and in the past was an indication of the future, and they were wrong. Last future, manned space. This is the one that bugs me the most. Manned space flight begins in 1959, 1958, 59, 60. Depends on where you can start counting. 1961, the Mercury program. 1965, Gemini. That's one guy, two guys, three guys. 68 to 72, Apollo. 4 missions to the moon in 1 year. 1969. Skylab, Apollo Soyuz, which was just, you had old junk lying around and wanted to make a political statement. The shuttle, and now we just, put our thumbs out and hope the Russians will take us. That was what was going on, and up until about here, there was a different looking future than down here. This was the future we saw in the 1960s and early 1970s. We're going places, we're doing things, we're landing on the moon, we're driving around, we're launching things into space, we're doing amazing things. And where are we going to go? Anybody ever seen the movie 2001? Okay, it's a movie in 1968 or 67, 68. The movie came out called 2001, which supposedly took place in the year 2001. And we have space stations, we have, well, that's the same space station, we have trips to Jupiter. Okay, this was the future we saw. What happened to that future?
It's still being worked on.
Yeah, sure.
Musk and the colonization of Mars.
Yeah.
The latest.
And
he's pushing it. You can see
he's certainly issuing press releases.
Absolutely.
Yes, but he says that he's going to bring back the thing.
Well,
that's ridiculous.
That's the catch.
He's going to fly something to Mars and then fly it back.
Right.
Why?
Sure, it can be done.
Take it apart and use it to build things on Mars. Okay, that's going to be really hard to come by. Okay, that's why I don't believe in his stuff.
They're talking about that.
He's getting stuff out of the 1958 Boys' Life is what he's getting that stuff out of. Why not? Why didn't this happen? It was certainly doable. Why didn't it happen? Come now, technology advanced plenty. It's a spacesuit. We had them. Okay, this is just a bunch of metal and plastic. We did one of these, about 2010, but a real small one, and we did Skylab, which was even smaller in the 1970s. So we could do this. It's not a technical issue. It's commonly thought that it's a technical issue, but it's not.
Like funding, nobody wasn't funded.
But why?
Because they had other interests, or governments had other interests.
Like
wars.
There you go. Okay, I'll buy that. Okay, that nobody was willing to lead. In the 1960s, we had John Kennedy saying, we're going to the moon in this decade. Let's go. And we had Johnson saying, let's keep going. We had Nixon who said, yeah, let's keep doing that. And then we had Ford who's, Carter, not really. And then Reagan, what? So, because we didn't want to. Or enough of us who voted didn't want to. And that's the only reason. Okay? The entire Apollo program cost. This was done this was an estimate done in 1975. $25.4 billion. That's how much it cost to do all of the flights. About $100 billion in the current funds. 2015, that's 1/38 of what we spent as a government. We could do it now, but we don't, and I don't know why. It's a future that's missed for a reason. This is one of those magic things. This is one of the bad magic things. The money's there, just take $600 billion for the military. Just take 1/6 of that, and off we go. But we ain't doing that. Why not? I'm not sure. We spent $300 billion last year just paying off savings bonds from people who gave us money from before. We spent $13 billion paying people not to grow things. And that's what the agriculture department does. They pay people not to grow, to keep the supply down. But that's the magic that really bugged me, just so if you haven't noticed. But it's a future that should have happened, in my opinion. It's one of those, where's my flying car? Where's my moon base? We should have one. We should have several. We should have a bunch.
Well, when China colonizes the moon, then
unfortunately, that is what's going to happen.
That's we'll suddenly have an emergency program to.
No, I think Joss Whedon, the guy who did Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Serenity and all those things, is right. When we go to space, we'll be speaking Chinese.
20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.